Is this okay? Everyone see my first slide?
Yes, thank you. It's good.
Okay. And yeah, you probably see behind me, I'm not at the office, but it's a Saturday, so I'm at home in the kids' room, and hopefully I'll be able to give this talk without too much interruptions. Um, I think I just changed the title of this talk this morning uh, to something that might be a disclaimer. I'm calling it Raising More Questions Than Answers. And I'm sure you're here to learn some answers from European Union and my study. But I think looking back at it, maybe the main takeaway is that is very, very complex, and there's different ways to think about it. And planning involves just engaging with what's happening and what influence you might have on what's happening and how things could happen. And that's very, very vague, but in the end, that's kind of the type of conversations you're going to need to have. Of course, I have all sorts of data I can show you, and I will show you. But I think that's one of the main things is that we're also working on this, and we're also struggling to understand everything. So I'm going to go to my first slide. Yeah. So one of the first things I'm going to talk about, kind of getting up from that, is a bit about terminology and also the policy context, because Europe is not really allowed to do spatial planning, yet it does all kinds of policies which do affect planning, and it thinks about things which are very, very close to planning. And one of them I'm going to talk about today is called land take. And this is what the European Union refers to as when you change non-urban land, let's say agriculture or forestry, and change it into something man-made for human consumption, urban. Now, we as planners wouldn't call it land take usually, we would call it urbanization or urban growth. And since it's happening not usually within cities, but on the outskirts of cities, we sometimes refer to that as greenfield development. So a bit of a mismatch between what the European policymakers are terming urbanization and what the planners do. And I personally dislike this term, land take, and I think most of you in Ukraine probably have also associations with what land take could be. It is very negative. You know, it sounds like you're really taking something over that's not yours. Uh, Armed conquest, one, but also maybe you're expropriating the public sector, saying we're taking your land away, and that's a little bit what how the Americans use the legal term takings. We also talk about land grabs. It has nothing to do with that. So when they're using this word land take, what they're just meaning is changing from non-urban functions to urban functions. And that doesn't necessarily have to be bad. Sometimes it's quite good. Think about cities themselves. They think of a growing city as something quite positive rather than something negative. So I think it's a very interesting frame the way this has entered the policy debate in Europe. And how did that happen? Well, the first time we really see this occur in a policy document is in the EU roadmap in 2011, and this was an idea to be more efficient with our natural resources. And so they said, well, let's strive for no net land take in 2050. So they saw this idea of let's reduce this urbanization, just like reduce CO2 emissions down to zero. And you see it's coming out of the environmental uh, policies. Uh, then there came the European Green Deal a few years ago, a very powerful strategy of Europe to coordinate all different types of sectors and policies towards sustainability. And part of this was the biodiversity strategy, and part of that was an EU soil strategy. And then it said, okay, this no net land take is important, and we're going to create a soil health law. Now, a few years later, the European Commission came with a legislative proposal. It wasn't a soil health law because they thought that maybe this is going to be too controversial to really mandate no net land take. But they said, okay, let's just require member states to measure their land take and other types of soil qualities. So that's what we have right now. A legislative proposal has been put into place. It's going through the European decision-making process, and its main thrust right now is just to monitor it. But of course, once you have a good monitoring system in place, then you can much easily mandate that no net land take goes to zero, just like we have done with CO2. It gives a definition of land take, but it doesn't really work out the details. It says that it's shifting from non-urban to urban, which it calls artificial, to create more even confusion there. But I say the devil is in the details. It's not that simple of just what is non-urban and what is urban. I'll give a few examples here. Here are two pictures of the Netherlands of parks, recreation areas. And according to the definition which is usually used, this is urban because it's for human use, for urban use. But you see on the left, there's a big difference in soil quality and soil sealing than on the right side. So you can imagine if the left side becomes transformed to even an urban park or a neighborhood, that's going to be much different than if the right side were to be transformed. So what are we really talking about when we say no net land take? Another example is agriculture. In the Netherlands, also, we have a lot of horticulture, thus the greenhouses. And many times there's also soil sealing. Most of these greenhouses have cement floors. And so if you were to break down some of these and build, let's say, a suburb, you would think maybe not so bad for the soil. But because it's listed as agriculture, it's considered a land take. You can really question that. The same applies to the pig farms that we have. If you were to urbanize this, or even put a city park here, that would be land take. The same applies to renewable energy. This is usually marked as industry, strangely enough. But yeah, is that land take? What kind of category is this? It's still not very clear, and there's more and more of these things being built in the Netherlands and probably all over Europe, and we really have to be clear about what it is we're going to be monitoring. And to do that, we usually use this Corine data, which I'll talk a bit later about. But here we see in the pink areas, that's urban, according to Corine, and the black is really the built-up areas. And you see to the left, a lot of those greenhouses, which are soil sealed but not taken. You also have, here's a part of Belgium above Antwerp, large areas which are considered urban, but there's almost no buildings there. So the data that you're going from to measure land take can be problematic. If you zoom into this area, which is considered urban, because it's pink, you see it's very, very low density, and it looks a bit like this. So this building to the left, this new house, is probably considered densification because it's being built in an urban area, but you see is very, very low density indeed. The same applies to areas which are seen as non-urban. If you zoom in on here on the data, here to the east of Warsaw, you see a similar type of low density neighborhood, but this was considered non-urban. So if you were to build here, perhaps it would be land take, whereas the previous one, if you were to build there, it would not be land take. But on the ground, they look pretty similar. The issue becomes even more murky if you were to talk about soil quality. and I'm not going to get into this, it's in Dutch anyway, but what we did is we did an analysis about soil quality in the Netherlands and the different types of um, land use classifications. And at least in our country, agriculture has pretty poor soil quality. And in fact, it was so poor, it was worse than urban parks and recreation. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to say we want to save soil quality by not allowing it to go from agriculture to urban parks. This actually be an improvement. And soil quality in the urban areas was about the same as agriculture. So, of course, we have a very intensive agriculture with a lot of environmental problems. This isn't for everyone, but it just demonstrates that the question is far from being resolved about what land take actually is and what you actually have to monitor and why, because they say they want to do this to protect the soil. So yeah, to sum up here, there's open questions on the classifications of what exactly is land use, what is urban, what is not, and about what if you want to look at it in terms of buildings, or if you want to look in terms of zoning, the data resolution makes a big difference. Quantity versus quality. How many hectares of land take are you taking, or if you're taking maybe valuable soil, should that count as more? All that stuff is not been resolved and is crucial for making policy. When you're talking about reducing it down to zero, what do you want to reduce to zero? That being said, from a planner's perspective, this is very important. Let's say that this was really to become a powerful policy, then you have to think who's going to be responsible. Member states, parts of member states, maybe no net land take as EU as a whole. So the Netherlands could take land if Bulgaria takes less land. We don't know. And planning, what should we do? Should we ensure in our spatial plans that there's less land take or not? And what kind of instruments can we use? Um, the European Commission has said, okay, well, here's an instrument, and they created a land take hierarchy, and I think most of you would recognize this from the circular economy. Avoid, reuse, minimize, compensate, these types of things. But again, if you don't know exactly what land take is, it's hard to take these steps. And as a planner, I always think that these are things you should probably do anyway. You don't want to build on a greenfield site if it's not necessary, for example. To get to the last point, where are we now? So the European Commission has shied away from calling this a sort of health law and just saying, okay, now we're just going to talk about monitoring. We'll talk about actually implementing no net land take as a real goal later. And there was a public consultation, lots of support for this, usually because this is among a small circle of environmental people who actually knew about this proposal. This year, it came into the European Parliament, and they voted on it. They passed it. So they said, okay, we think it's a okay idea, but they put on some amendments which more or less weaken it further. So it's to measure it, but the measurement is a bit more fuzzy now. European Council was next, and it also took the Commission's proposal, said, okay, we'll pass it, but also we have our own amendments, and those are mostly also weakening it. So now what happens is that all three European institutions come together in what they call a trialogue. And if they can all agree on this, a new amended proposal, it becomes law. So that's where we are now. So we don't know if this is going to pass or not, especially considering the new commission and the politics there. But that's where we are now. In theory, very, very close. Yeah. So you can also raise a lot of questions about this, as spatial planners, what you're actually trying to do with the no-net land take and why you want to do it, how you're going to do it. And I think the last one is even right way to be talking about this. If you're talking about the phenomenon, it's the conversion of rural to urban land, and maybe there's very good reasons for that. And that seems to be not part of the picture. Everything is being now focused on how much land is being taken. Another issue is the urban sprawl. Is seen as something that we need to reduce in Europe as well. And I'm originally from the United States, so I'm from the country which maybe invented urban sprawl. And if you look in the dictionary, I thought there was a very nice definition of what sprawl means: to cause to spread out carelessly or awkwardly. No, he was sprawled out on the couch, you can say. But this is then applied to cities, that they're spreading out carelessly and awkwardly. And so there's a bit of unplannedness to this. There's a bit about that it's not really compact and efficient and high density. And they say also often monofunctional and car dependent, because you're not thinking well about how to provide, let's say, public transit. But just also, like land take, nobody is an advocate for urban sprawl. You can even see the, carelessly and awkwardly. No, you're not for that. That always sounds bad. So again, it's a very normative concept, and that's problematic when you're talking about measuring sprawl and what is sprawl. The European Environment Agency tried to do just that, and they came up with a very complicated mathematical equation for sprawl in Europe, where they're looking at urban expansion and density and a bit of land take in there, and they came up then with a ranking of who sprawls the most. And as a Dutch planner, it broke my heart a bit, because we think that we're so good at managing urban growth, and we don't have any urban sprawl at all in our country many times, we'd like to say. And Belgium is seen as the worst. They're totally sprawling, but we're not. And here it looks like we're even worse than Belgium, and according to this definition. So yeah, it's how you measure it. I think we are partially penalized because we had just a lot of urban areas. But yeah, again, here you can say, what's the definition? In the scientific literature, there's all sorts of different types of definitions and operationalizations. It's difficult to say if urban sprawl is static, that you can say that there's a city that's sprawled, or if it's only a process, that urban sprawl is only about change. And how do we measure it? If we're talking about unplanned, or how do you measure unplanned? And then, of course, should we really do anything about this? And is this how we should be talking about this in the first place? My answer was, when I was bidding for the Espan Super project, a resounding no. So now I'm going to go into the research which at hand, and that's the Espan project. The Super project stands for Sustainable Urbanization Practices in European Regions. And Espan is a European policy research program, and it contracts every research project out, and so different types of partners compete with each other to get the project. And the question that they wanted answered was, how to stop land take and uncontrolled urban growth. So land take and sprawl. And they want to know how the land use has changed and how you can become more sustainable. So we said, okay, we'll look into that, but we're not going to call it land take and sprawl. We're going to use different terminology. And this project also resulted in a book, and I'm just plugging my book right here. And the only reason why I'm really plugging it is because it's free. So I think it's okay to give advertisements for things that don't cost anything. So if you're interested in the academic side of it, we rewrote the super project to book, and it's informing my lecture today. In the book, but also in the project, we had this conceptual model, and it's showing cause and effect. On the right side, you have the effects, and you can see that you have an amount of urbanization, which you can count. That's quantitative. You could call it land take, but that's the amount of hectares being converted. But also you have a qualitative aspect. How does it look? What type of forms is it taking on? And on the left side, you have the drivers. And many of these drivers are quite well known in research, things like population development, economic, but also institutions. The rules that we have in our countries regarding, for example, taxes, because that governs how lucrative it is to convert land. But in the middle, that is sometimes a black box, because you have these push factors, but how does that convert into the actual decisions to allow urbanization? Because most places have an urban planning department that has to give a permit, and how does that happen? And so that we want to also peer into the black box. And then we drew a circle around this whole thing, and you can ask, is this sustainable, this whole machine, which creates this urban growth? When you're talking about is it sustainable, we just take the general people, planet, profit, which model, which is, of course, to some very, very simplistic. It is, but that's part of the beauty of it. You can at least say, okay, we're going to divide it up into 3 dimensions, and then talk about the different dimensions. And we did the same thing for urbanization in terms of phenomenon, how it occurs. That you can talk about compact urbanization, diffuse urbanization. Other people would call it sprawl, but we say, well, we see things scattered about. We'll call that diffuse. And then in the middle, if it's clumped in different centers, we call it polycentric. So these are different types of concepts to replace the land take and sprawl ideas. So let's look at the developments. What does Europe look like in terms of urbanization? I think this picture tells a lot. It's just the famous satellite image of Europe at night. And if you gaze at this, you see a few large megacities, but not a whole lot. You see many, many scattered mid-sized towns all throughout Europe. And you also see very clearly many of the coasts. So we're urbanizing along beaches and sometimes along rivers. So if you look at some rivers, certainly the Nile is very prominent here. You can kind of see that, okay, get a feel for the type of urbanization that we have, the urban structure that we have at present. But how do we analyze this? How do we understand this further quantitatively? Well, we have now pretty good data for this, and I'm quite happy to say we have the satellite data for 2019, and this is the world settlement footprint. It's also free to use and download. So if you click the link below, you can go on your browser and go over the entire world and zoom into a high level of resolution of what is, let's say, soil sealed, what is built upon. And there's even what they call an evolution. So you can see what was built upon in the 1980s, that's red, up to 2015, which is purple. And here's a part of the Netherlands, and you see the old urban structure, but also quite a bit of new development in the 1990s. And 2000, but mainly in the 1990s. And this was due to our planning. This was very planned development, and I think most Dutch planners wouldn't call this sprawl. But what's the land use? That is just telling if something has been built on, yes or no. But if you're talking about changes from functions, from agriculture or nature to urban, then you have to know a bit more about not just if something has a building on it, but what the function is. And then we have this Corine data, and that's broken down into 44 different classes. So you have quite a bit of information there, but you see it's much less, it's lower resolution. So that's also a problem. So yeah, what is urbanization? It's a bit of how you look at it. The data on soil sealing, if you're saying that if there's a building there, that's urbanization, then you have very good high quality data, but you only have this binary yes or no, and it registers everything. So probably solar panels are there as well. If there's something in an agricultural area, a shed, that will be registered as well, a street. But maybe you don't want to call that urbanization or land take. And yeah, when you're talking about the other one, the Corine data with all those classes, then you have to discuss which classes will we consider urban and which not. And that we get back to the first part, the talk about the troubles with land take that we have right now. And right now, it seems like the politics is moving towards that Corine, which has the land use data. But the problem there is the resolution is not high enough for that low density development. So if you have scattered, really diffuse urban development, it might not register, and then it might look that you're doing no land take at all. So if the sprawl is a lot, there's no land take because it flies under the radar of the Corine data. And there's also problems with classification because the red is not just residences, but it's sometimes businesses too. So many city centers are just all red, urban fabric, despite that lots of those buildings are for businesses. So it makes it very hard to do good analyses on urban functions. And of course, this is just land cover. What is on the land? It doesn't say anything about how dense it is. And that's, for planners, is very, very important because it matters a lot if you're paving an area and it's just 1 story high, or if it's 7 stories high, because it makes a big difference in terms of urban functions, but also how you save other parts of land. And that is right now outside the discussion, unfortunately. So that being said, you can ask the big question, how much land has been taken in Europe in the last 20 years? And using the Corine data, which is, again, problematic, but what's the standard, it's more than 1 million, that should be hectares, not meters, hectares of land being converted. So yeah, it's much more than 0. So we certainly haven't gotten no net land take to 0. It's about 185 hectares per day, 250 football pitches per day, if you prefer that. And it's a one-way process. So there is some urban use being converted back to non-urban, but that's usually things like construction sites where they never built anything and it goes back, or some mines or quarries that could get converted back. Not a whole lot of real urban areas are being converted back. So the old planning adage that once you build on it, you're never getting it back, we see that in the data as well. We can also analyze the data to see what kinds of land take or urbanization is happening, and who is urbanizing the most. And you see the big countries are urbanizing the most, as you might expect. But You also see some are slowing down. So Spain was urbanizing a whole lot in 2000 to 2006, but it's doing less and less. So I would say maybe on a sustainable path if you think that urban growth is bad. Um, and some places are accelerating. Poland and the UK are urbanizing more and more. I'm really curious about the next. I think next year we'll get another Corine, so we'll know what happened more recently. But right now it goes up to 2018. And getting to density, since we know the population of these areas, we can also ask a little bit about, okay, we have all these hectares being built, but are they accommodating a real need? And what kinds of places in Europe have high densities? Well, Europe as a whole, it's about 1 hectare per person or 5% urban. But of course, that tells you nothing when you talk about a continent. So you always have to draw a line somewhere. And then you ask yourself, and this is what we call area-based density, is the most basic way of imagining or measuring density. Is you ask how many people are within a geographical unit. But that depends very much on which unit. Are you talking about a member state? Or are you talking about a region, province, neighborhood? It will all change. In Europe, a lot of times we use this NUTS nomenclature, and NUTS 3 is one that is used quite a bit. It's the city region area. And according to this, Paris is the most dense place in Europe, more than 10 times of Amsterdam, Milan, and 30 times of Barcelona, which is crazy because almost everyone who knows Barcelona is an extremely dense city. How can that be? And that has to do with how these NUTS 3 regions are drawn, because it's also that Barcelona region includes a lot of non-urbanized area, which brings its total urbanization down at the NUTS 3 level. But it has some of the most dense neighborhoods of all of Europe. So yeah, this method has been also criticized. If I go to the bottom of the slide, you can say, well, we'll just look at the urban areas. So for Barcelona, we'll disregard all that green space within the NUTS 3 area. And if you do that, or if you say we'll just measure the urban density where most population live, which is called population weighted, Spanish and Greek cities have the most dense. And then the last one is, yeah, density is also a bit in the eye of the beholder and depends on urban form and architecture. I have 3 drawings at the bottom. All 3 are the same amount of density, but one is just one large high-rise building, and the other is, let's say, a small suburb with everyone in their own gardens. One might be perceived as much higher density than the other, even though the amount of people per hectare is the same. So that's quite subjective as well. Urban form is another issue. How do we measure that? Because yeah, we talk about sprawl, but if we look at that satellite image, we see different types of ways that cities grow. We see, for example, on the left, a compact city with on the hinterlands, lots and lots of development along roadways. You see in valleys being built more polycentric. How can you come to grips with this? Well, we did an analysis of this, and we did a visual analysis, and we took our 3 compact, polycentric, and diffuse, and we had a couple in between categories, and we asked people to rank these. What do you see here? And the first thing we notice is that you can actually see 2 things at once. There's a thing that you first see, for example, on the left, which you see first is that there's one main core, and then outside scattered small villages. So the main core, you could say that's monocentric. That's the top, that gets a 1. And the other scattered, that looks more like the number 4 down here. On the right, you see 2 main cores, so you give it a 2, and then the outside is more diffuse, so you would give it a 5. So we went through all 1,400 NUTS 3 regions in Europe and classified them like this, and produce maps. And so here on the left side, you see the main structure, what you see first, and for example, compact monocentric. You see that a lot in Spain, France, everywhere. We see all the different types all over the place. And what's interesting is more the one on the right. If you're talking about urban sprawl, then you're talking about what areas look very, very sprawl-like in the substructure. And then you see quite a bit north of France, Poland, Romania, these types of areas. And again, yeah, Belgium, Flanders, a lot of diffuse development there. And you can also say, how has this changed in the last 20 years? We can look at that as well. Has it become more diffuse? Where are the hotspots of the new development, let's say, sprawling out, becoming diffuse? And then you see also lots in Flanders, lots in Poland again. And just to show you an area in one of these dark, diffuse areas, here's kind of what it looks like if you zoom in on Google Earth. So this is the type of development we're talking about. Okay, that was the past. So 2000 to 2018. How could it look in the future? What we did is we created 3 scenarios, and the scenarios match our idea of urbanization. So we had a compact one, a polycentric one, and a diffuse one, and imagined what would happen to Europe if all development followed along these 3 different logics. And we used a spatial allocation model. So what we did is we estimated suitability according to the logic of each scenario, and the model would then select sites that would say this is suitable for development. Then it would take the amount of perceived demand and allocate areas where it would think is the most likely to change from non-urban to urban. And so here's an example of let's say, one run, and we run it over and over and over again in 5-year intervals until it got to 2050. So this is the result. Europe in 2012, Europe in 2050. I think this is a diffuse scenario. Really hard to see anything unless you zoom in. And I'm going to zoom in on the area that I know the best, the Netherlands. Here you have it. This is the compact scenario. And if you look closely on the edges of cities, you see darker red. And that's the new urban development in the Netherlands up to 2050 in the compact scenario. If you look at the polycentric, you get a difference. So going back and forth to polycentric and compact, and then the diffuse. So here you see clearly different areas. I'm going back and forth. I hope this is working with the upload. You see different areas getting urbanized according to the scenario logic. And this is not, I'm saying this is not really a prediction, but it's a way to start talking about the future. You also see there's not a huge amount of difference because, yeah, a lot of the urbanization had already occurred over the last thousands of years. So it doesn't change a whole lot. There is some differences you can see. And these are also drastic scenarios. So it probably would be a mix of one of these. But I think what's important is how you use it. Looking into parts of Europe and seeing which areas get urbanized in each of these areas, you can talk to policymakers and say, is this what we want? are we building over a landscape that we really care about? If the city extends on this area, will we be able to service it by public transit? Will it create more demand for more development in that area? Things like that. So it's very good for, let's say, thinking about strategies. But it's not prediction. It's let's say a decision to support system, a way of talking about the future, to make decisions about how you can control the future. And I put this slide because then you go to the next step, which is actually changing the future. And at least in the Netherlands, we tried to do that by balancing different interests and balancing different challenges. So you have, of course, climate adaptation. That's a challenge of, let's say, the water management and of soil quality, things like that. But you also have challenges regarded to energy infrastructure, but also new roads and things like that. And then you have the challenge of building new houses. So all these things are interrelated, because if you build new houses, it's going to change the infrastructure needs and put strains on them, and that will also put strains on the natural systems. So it's a big puzzle that we're trying to do, and we don't do it alone as a planner top down, but we try to do that with all different types of stakeholders. And yeah, the outcome is sometimes uncertain, but it's always a dialogue. And so it's part science of knowing what the challenges are and measuring them, and part, let's say, democratic process. So how do you do this? We looked in the super project, and that there's a potential toolkit, and I think you're going to talk about this later in the day, so I'm not going to be going into too much detail here, but you have regulations and visions and rules and projects, all these things that you can do as public sector to try to influence how land gets developed. And we surveyed over 200 of these in Europe, and we also asked whether or not they were successful or not. And I guess, unfortunately for you, the answer is we couldn't statistically say whether one kind of intervention is more successful than the other, that let's say a regulation is more successful than a governance arrangement or a subsidy. Many of them had drawbacks, but what we were able to find is when we were looking at the reasons why things were successful, we did find some regularities. So we found that if things were considered one-dimensional, they were usually considered less successful. Market orientation was sometimes considered less successful. Collaboration, coordination, on the other hand, were considered more keys to success. I think this would be quite familiar to most planners. An interesting one here, though, is that decentralization and centralization were about even. So the amount of people that said that decentralized is successful was about the same as the other way around. So that maybe nuances the whole discussions about whether everything should be done at the national level or the local level. And then we also looked at different types of urbanization. So you can say we're going to try for more compact urbanization. This is a picture of the finger city of Copenhagen, where they were trying to push urbanization along what they said they're the fingers. And areas between the fingers are forbidden to develop. And yeah, that has a advantage that you help for transit-oriented development and efficiency, but it also can drive up prices and cause gentrification. So there's sometimes side effects to your policies. You can also try to say, well, we like communities, smaller towns, and if we have a big need for new development, let's make new towns or growth centers, things like that, and we can link those up, for example, with a rail network, transit-oriented developments. Yeah, that you see a whole literature on that as well in Europe. And many times this is also done for preserving recreational areas between towns and food production that's near the people who need it. And yeah, you can say we want actually diffuse urbanization. Maybe you have too many people living in flats, and there's a big desire to live in more single-family homes. Maybe there's so much car congestion, and you want to give people a place to park their cars, things like this. Most of the suburban, let's say, diffuse urbanization is not necessarily planned for, though. It's usually a lack of planning, which just seems to happen. But you can also see what are advantages and disadvantages here. Well, one advantage is often that people are quite happy with their surroundings, and maybe the concentration of pollution might be less. It could be that there's much more pollution because people drive more, but because it's so diffuse and spread out, it might be less concentrated. Yeah, and different countries have different planning systems. So I've talked a lot about the Netherlands today, and we try to balance interests and put the puzzle pieces together with others. Other countries do it in their own way, and so there's a lot of research on which kinds of planning regimes or planning traditions are more effective, and how you can improve, let's say, the effectiveness within your regime, because sometimes it's hard to change things as well. So there's a lot of literature on this as well. And finally, European planning. I think I started off this whole talk saying that Europe doesn't plan. It's not in the EU treaty. It's not allowed to plan. But we did some research in the Netherlands, putting all the European policies on top of each other, and we see that there are no white spots left. So the Netherlands is completely full of European policies. Many of them come from environment, but sometimes you see other things like structure funds as well. And this is not necessarily coordinated, and sometimes this can cause some tensions for planners because you can't necessarily change these laws. These are ones that are given to you at a higher level of scale. So I'm going to end my talk here by just giving a couple reflections on sustainability, whether all this I've talked about is sustainable or not. So what we did in our book is we did a literature review, and we took our three types, the compact, polycentric, and diffuse urban forms, and we contrasted that to the three dimensions of sustainability. And we had about 200 different academic sources, and we tried to rate them, whether or not they come up with a plus that, let's say, for example, compact in economy, compact development is good for the economic sustainability, then we would give it a plus or a plus plus if it was very clear. And then we tried to measure the amount of sustainability. And as you would expect, compact and polycentric came out better than diffuse. But our main takeaway, and here you see all the pluses and minuses with each other, of course, it's in the book. What you see is there's also some trade-offs between dimensions of sustainability. So economic sustainability can be plus, while ecological might be more of a minus. But also even within, you see some trade-offs as well, that sometimes you have, for example, compact development is good for reducing the land take and preserving open space outside, but it also can concentrate pollution. So things like that. In the end, it really matters. This is a normative decision that needs to be taken. Politicians have to decide in the end, and not scientists, about which way to go forward, because there are real trade-offs, real decisions to be made, which may not benefit everyone. When you look at the land take, you see certain areas here on the left that are, let's say, taking more land per day than others. And you can say, well, maybe they're not being so sustainable. But it also depends on what kind of land is being taken. Is it natural land or agricultural land? And for example, the Netherlands is almost all agricultural land, and that doesn't have such high soil quality anyway. Maybe we should be more concerned, if you look at the right, with the areas that are green. Those are natural areas being taken for urbanization. And the idea of population development is not just about hectares being converted, but these hectares are being converted for a reason. And if you look at growing areas, are they taking land and growing in population? Well, that's one thing. But if you're taking a lot of land, urbanizing a lot with a shrinking population, that's arguably less sustainable. And those are the red regions here to the right on the map. Maybe you should be mostly concerned about these areas because they're maybe urbanizing without really the need to do it. You can also look over time. The amount of urbanization in hectares has been going down gradually. Not to zero, certainly, but if you're thinking about reducing land take, the trend is there already. And another thing we did was a regression analysis looking at the 5 different types of urban form, from the really compact to the sprawl, and we didn't come to very significant outcomes, except for the very last one. Sprawl was slightly less sustainable. But even more sustainable was GDP in terms of positive things. So it was, I think the jury is still out. We're still not really there that we can say that one kind of urban form is better than the other. There's a lot of trade-offs to be made and a lot of decisions to be made. And I think I'm going to end here with interventions. It's a very complicated slide, but I think what it says here is this was the outcome of our case studies. Each case study looked at an intervention to make urbanization more sustainable. And one thing that we discovered, besides the fact that many times the need was ecological, but the intervention itself was a bit more broad, which sometimes was a good thing, was that the people we interviewed, by and large, said that the intervention made a difference. So even if we couldn't necessarily see on the ground in terms of the data that there was less urbanization happening, the interview stakeholders really said that if we hadn't done it, it would be worse. So I would say this gives a bit of a positive view, a happy note, I suppose, that it really does matter what we're doing here. So I'm going to get my final conclusions. The EU slogan is united in diversity, and I think that holds also for urbanization. Very heterogeneous. Different areas are urbanizing at different rates, in different directions, in different ways. And we see that there are different types of regimes at the national level to regulate growth, different types of interventions occurring. So I see it as a gigantic policy laboratory in Europe. Everyone's struggling with this, dealing with it in their own way. And there's no silver bullet. There's no one best way to do this, but I think there's a lot of ways that we can learn from each other. And I think that what Esbon is doing is very good, to bring people together and starting dialogues. And conferences like this today, what you're going to be doing, is to be talking to each other about what works and where and why. And in the end, what was seen as success factors are the same things that planners basically have been arguing for years: more cooperation, more coordination, and having a long-term perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you greatly, David. That was a hell of a presentation, I must say. I think everybody has been really struck with the amount of different perspectives you've brought to the table right now. I mean, I'm just going to give maybe a 3-minute reflection and then ask a question on some on one of the things you've mentioned. So my reflection is concerning the of course, yeah, we are the kind of the legend holder on the map. This is very visible, so there is no Ukraine in this data. However, the closest thing that I was looking at were Romania and Poland, which were red in every kind of map you've shown almost, which are both countries experiencing quite heavy depopulation. I mean, Romania more, Poland less. And quite high urbanization rates at the same moment. So that, for me, was a signal that the policy level response to the issue, I mean, is maybe quite a serious concern for places or for countries and for areas that do not understand that they're urbanizing while losing population. So this is a very concerning thing, and I believe you haven't mentioned much, but we are also urbanizing not just by housing. We're also urbanizing by a whole lot of infrastructure, by warehouses. You've mentioned the variety of industrial type of livestock industry and so on. So there is much more that is not visible at first, and that is happening in areas which do not have high economic growth, which do not have high population growth, but they're still heavily urbanizing due to some external factors, ongoing suburbanization, investment into some specific infrastructure projects and so on, which does bring to me kind of this alert mark that us not seeing the population rate or economic growth rate, we under that direction can also experience quite heavy rate of urbanization, which we have to deal with. And the other component you've mentioned in the beginning, I think is heavily relevant to Ukraine, is regarding the soil health, because Ukraine is a country which is not so heavily urbanized as a proportion of the country, but we are a very heavily ploughed country with the highest areas of arable land in the world by country, meaning that our concern is with this specific type of soil issue rather than urbanization in its classic way. So it is maybe for Ukraine as a country, it is more concerning to understand that municipalities now having land use rights, having land use monopoly over the territory, are now responsible for managing all of this agricultural land, which can be urbanized quite easily and which can also by itself contribute heavily to destructive land use, which is not urban. So this kind of complex relationship, I think, is a thing that maybe we'll touch upon today a little bit. But the question I had for you is a little bit about how do you perceive within the case studies where you've identified these three programmatic directions of cooperation, synchronization, and long-term perspective. Can you maybe give something concrete how that feels for the policymakers on the ground? How does that make a difference compared to other kind of types of approaches that were used in those case studies?
Well, of course, every case is different. And one case which was inspiring was in Italy, because there they were having a lot of competition for urbanization in this area. And it was looking very much like urban sprawl, not so much a lot of duplications. So you many times will have one municipality wanting a shopping mall or a business park, where the other municipality across the border wants the same thing. So through this competition and mistrust, they were able to reframe, let's say, the governance through creating a metropolitan area where they can make a plan together. And then they could decide together. This also happened in Austria as well in our case study. And we saw that by coming together and deciding to really make a plan, that they acknowledged that this competition was a race to the bottom, that didn't benefit them at all in the end. And yeah, it was about coming together and building this trust and thinking about the long-term perspective. A couple success stories there. I thought Valencia was an interesting one because Valencia had this rural area just on the outskirts of town, which was just agricultural, so it wasn't protected nature or anything like that, but very fertile, and people liked it as part of the cultural heritage to have this area. But it was being urbanized very rapidly, and they were trying to protect it using rules and regulations and not being very successful about this. It was going against the needs of the farmers, and the farmers many times were very happy to sell their land to developers and make some money. So what turned out to be crucial in Valencia was to get the farmers on board and to build an alliance between the environmentalists and the farmers to protect this fertile land from urbanization. And so they're different lessons. And again, I can talk about these stories and things that work, but that doesn't necessarily mean it will work in Ukraine because every region has its own way of doing things. What it can do is it gives policymakers a story, some hope, something to talk about. And many times they think about impossibilities that would never work here. But then you show, yes, somewhere else in Europe, it is working. And so you can maybe break open these confines that they have.
Do we have questions from people here? Any comments, reflections on what David presented? We also have, I think, some part of our team online. Maybe those who are for the speakers section can also open up their mic and ask if they have anything right now. Okay, well, maybe people are still reflecting on all of the different components you brought in. Regarding the thing about the influence of European policies on the country level, I think we haven't yet seen anything like you've shown about the Netherlands, how the country is overlaid with different policy markings in Ukraine, of course. But I think this is going to happen quite soon in a variety of ways. And what is your take on maybe understanding that there is this confining or regulating forms that are being brought on from Brussels on the national land use policy, and how is that reflected in Dutch spatial planning processes or maybe discussions?
Well, okay, let's imagine Ukraine joins the European Union. Then the policy is not just Brussels imposing that on Ukraine, of course, because then Ukraine is part of the decision making. So you are Brussels in a sense. So all the member states come together and they decide certain things. For example, that we want to protect certain habitats, or we want to ensure that there's a minimum standard of air quality in Europe. And that may or may not affect the Ukraine. It could be that the habitats that you want to preserve are exactly the same, and that's generally what happens. You just say these are important habitats, but once it becomes European, you can't just change your mind. And that's something that the Dutch have had problems with because they designated many habitats and now they're not allowed to build with it. And then the politics changes, and then you have politicians who say, well, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. We prefer not to have those habitats. But you can't do that because it's then been agreed upon with all member states. So yes, there is a certain rigidity in this. On the other hand, I think as planners, we kind of like that as well, because it helps the predictability. It helps you plan to have these the knowledge that certain areas of natural importance will remain so. And then you can plan around that and make the best of it. And not everything is restrictions. If Ukraine comes into European Union, just like many member states like Bulgaria and Romania and Poland, Spain, they'll receive a lot of structure funds. And these are areas to develop the economy. And then planners are very important about how are you going to use these? Are you going to use it for rail transport, for road transport? Where are you going to route it? Which connections are important? Because this will determine urban growth as well. So, yes, in a sense, European policy could become very, very important to Ukraine in the future. I think in general, and maybe it's my personal opinion, a lot of this is positive as well for planning. That you have this European level, which also protects you from yourself, from building over natural habitats or making developments where the air quality is too poor to breathe.
Great, thank you. Anything from the room?
Thank you so much. It was very interesting, very useful. And my very short questions about challenges. What you mean about key challenges for implement the general special agenda in European Union countries in context of new risks, in new challenges, safety challenges, of course, connecting with Ukrainian context, connecting with new challenges, climate challenges, which we faced every month, maybe now, and that's about challenges, my question.
Yeah, European challenges. I think Europe is so diverse that every territory has its own challenges. And these challenges manifest itself at different levels of scale. If you're talking about climate change, you're talking about, let's say, flood risks, and that you look at in terms of river basins. And that can cross national borders, so it can be quite huge. Some challenges are quite local about, let's say, how to build more houses for the housing market. And yeah, or in case of Ukraine, I think a big challenge will be how to rebuild after the war in a way that is going to be sustainable, because there'll be a huge push, of course, to rebuild as quickly as possible. And I think planners will have to play a role of resisting temptation of just say, build anywhere as fast as you can, just to get it done, but to think, how can we build back in a smart way? Build in a way which we won't regret later that we just covered over the last most important fertile land, and in a very low density area where everyone now needs a car, things like that. So think about where you want to be in the future. And I think for Ukraine, that's how you want to develop and redevelop and densities is going to be crucial, especially looking at climate change as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. I also think we, beyond the Russian invasion and the impacts it had, we were facing quite severe droughts last 10 years in the south of Ukraine, for instance, and also floods in the Carpathian region, which are all due to unsustainable land use practices, but not directly related to urbanization again. So I think this is where we now, again, sorry that I'm referring to my previous point directly, as planners, because the communes are now responsible for all of this variety of land uses within their territory, it's need to be for them to be brought to the level of understanding that they are actually responsible for these macro processes that are impacting neighboring communities, impacting the regions, the countries, whether they restrict further deforestation or they create parks, whether they support creation of free-floating rivers or they extend agriculture activities. It will have a huge impact on the future of the country and also on the urban habitats we now have. And I think this interconnection, which is in a good way brought by your research to link the areas that are not urban and to think about how does that connection make sense and how to quantify and qualitatively analyze it, I think is crucial in Ukraine, where communes are now responsible for hundreds of hectares of lands, which is completely not urban, which is something that is used as it is used now. And their ability to manage it properly will, I think, importantly define the scale of sustainable land use, including urbanization, but as I think in Ukrainian case, less of urbanization, but more of land management on a broader scale. So I'm very thankful for your Saturday involvement, David. And we are now going to have a coffee break. So please not disconnect from Zoom. We will be back in 15 minutes with our first session. And again, thank you all for being here, and see you in 15 minutes.
Bye, thank you.